Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video related to the ongoing Ukraine conflict, but this is not about Ukraine itself. It is about Ukraine's neighbor, Moldova, and how Moldova has kind of made a very miscalculated decision over the last 10 or 15 years or so. Now, since February of 2022, Russia has launched a special operation or an invasion of the Ukraine and are basically planning to annex a huge chunk of the Ukraine along with the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But Ukraine's neighbor, Moldova, has recently applied for European Union status or EU status, meaning that Moldova is now trying to join the EU. Now that isn't a bad thing, it is just they waited too long and their military has been heavily degraded over the last 10 or 15 years or so. Now this video is mostly going to be about the Moldovan Air Force and how Moldova has basically sold off all of their useful fighter aircraft. Moldova basically has no active frontline fighter aircraft of any kind and is mostly relying on a small number of transport and utility aircraft, as their air force basically almost doesn't exist, as they have sold off a large chunk of their military hardware over the last decade or so. And this is very bad for Moldova, as they might end up getting invaded by Russia too at some point, and now they have no air defense or air force to defend themselves, unlike Ukraine. Ukraine had a small air force and released 100 or so warplanes, half of which were fighter planes. They had enough warplanes to at least contest the skies over their territory, whereas Moldova now has only a handful of light utility aircraft and no fixed-wing fighter or even drone aircraft to combat the Russian Air Force in case of an invasion. When Moldova gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, they had an inventory of 34 MiG-29C and D models of fixed-wing and multi-role fighter aircraft. They also had a handful of MiG-23 fighter and bomber aircraft, and they also had a number of helicopters and helicopter gunships, mostly the Mi-8 helicopter, and at least 5 to 6 heavy transport aircraft, mostly the Antonov AN-72, the Tupolev Tu-134, and the Antonov AN-26, which were all Soviet-era transport aircraft that were left to Moldova when the Soviet and Russian army pulled out of Moldova in 1991. Now, in the 2000s and 2010s, Moldova decided to sell off most of their military-grade warplanes. That includes their MiG-29 Falcon fighter aircraft, which were sold to other nations like Eritrea, Yemen, and the United States. They also sold off a large chunk of their transport aircraft, leaving them with only one functioning Antonov AN-26. This means that in only one functioning heavy transport aircraft, the aforementioned Antonov AN-26. They also have a small number of even older Antonov AN-2s, which were old Soviet aircraft from the 1940s, but these are all sitting in storage and haven't been in use since the early 1990s. And they also have one Tupolev Tu-134 and one or two AN-24s or Antonov AN-24s that are also sitting in disrepair at various hangars throughout Moldova. So Moldova basically has almost no air force and not much of an air defense either. The only air defense systems that are left are 25 old unupgraded SA-3 and SA-5 surface-to-air missile battery systems that were left behind by the Soviet forces in 1991, and these systems have not been updated at all. This means that Moldova has basically no air force to defend themselves, and they have barely any air defense systems at all. So if Russia wanted to invade Moldova today, they would have almost no real opposition. Not only that, but the Moldovan armed forces are also smaller than they were in the previous decades. When Moldova gained its independence from the Soviet Union, they had an army of about 10 to 15,000 troops. The Moldovan army now only has about 5 to 7,000 troops, so only about 2/3 or half of what they had in the 1990s. So not only does Moldova not have a real air force at this point. They don't really have much of a ground force either. Back in the year 1992, there was actually a war between Moldova and a breakaway state known as Transnistria. Transnistria pretty much being one of the last Soviet republics still in existence to this day. And they broke away from Moldova in the summer of 1992, and that led to a conflict that pretty much ended in stalemate, as Transnistria to this day still has not been reincorporated into Moldova. Now, Transnistria remaining separate from Moldova is one of the reasons why Moldova has not been accepted into NATO, as the Transnistrian War is considered a frozen conflict where the fighting has ended but there has not been any permanent ceasefire signed. And as a result, Moldova does not recognize Transnistria, and Transnistria does not recognize itself as Moldova. So as a result, Moldova only has one option, and that is to join the EU, similar to what Ukraine was trying to do before the 2014 conflict and the current conflict, which is how Ukraine managed to get a hold of some weaponry before the Russian invasion. So it seems as if Moldova is trying to do the same thing by becoming more friendly with the EU and trying to join the EU with the hopes of gaining some military equipment to replace the older Soviet weapons they either sold off in the case of the MiG-29 or are just sitting abandoned or derelict in various hangars throughout Moldova. So what do you all think of this? This is pretty much the worst case scenario. If you thought Ukraine was unprepared for a Russian invasion, then you have not seen how bad Moldova is at this point when it comes to weapons, and especially the lack of an air force. They basically have no fighters, no bombers, and only a handful of helicopters and transport aircraft. So what do you all think of this? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.